You are listening to a Roamcast with Neil Kramer.
Yeah, we don't want to do anything to scare your children. That's the last thing we want to do. We don't want to scare anybody.
If you like your health care plan, you'll be able to keep your health care plan.
If you like your plan and your doctor, you can keep them.
You'll be able to keep your health care plan.
If you like your plan, you keep your plan.
If you like your doctor, you like your plan, you can keep your doctor, you can keep your plan.
You like your current insurance, you keep that insurance. Period. End of story.
With the Affordable Care Act due to come into effect in just a few weeks' time,
Good morning, everybody.
the president was forced to make changes after it emerged that some people who currently have health insurance actually stood to lose it under his plan.
They feel misled, and you've seen the anger that's out there.
You know, I regret very much that what we intended to do, which is to make sure that everybody is moving into better plans because they want them as opposed to because they're forced into it, that, you know, we weren't as clear as we needed to be in terms of the changes that were taking place. Given that I've been burned already with a website, well, more importantly, the American people have been burned by a website that has been dysfunctional.
And I have to tell you, you know, Obamacare is really, I think, the worst thing that has happened in this nation since slavery. And it is, in a way, it is slavery, in a way, because it is making all of us subservient to the government. And it was never about health care, it was about control. And that's why when this administration took office, it didn't matter that the country was going off the cliff economically. All forces were directed toward getting this legislation passed. And why did they want to pass it so badly? Well, as I said the other night on television, Vladimir Lenin, one of the fathers of socialism and communism, said that socialized medicine is the keystone to the establishment of a socialist state. So this is, you know, some people have said, oh, come on, you're being paranoid. How could anybody bring up something like that? I would say, if you know anything about history, how could you not bring it up?
When I'm president, meetings where laws are written will be more open to the public, no more secrecy. That's a commitment I make to you as president. I'll make our government open and transparent so that anyone can ensure that our business is the people's business.
There is no spying on Americans. We don't have a domestic spying program.
We have put in place the toughest ethics laws and toughest transparency rules of any administration in history. In history. The way to make government responsible is to hold it accountable. And the way to make government accountable is make it transparent so that the American people can know exactly what decisions are being made, how they're being made, and whether their interests are being well served. The Freedom of Information Act is perhaps the most powerful instrument we have for making our government honest and transparent, and of holding it accountable. And I expect members of my administration not simply to live up to the letter, but also the spirit of this law. Let me say it as simply as I can. Transparency and the rule of law will be the touchstones of this presidency.
First report on press freedom in the United States ever published by the Committee to Protect Journalists, which usually advocates for press freedoms overseas, and the news isn't good. Titled The Obama Administration and the Press, the report looks at the many ways President Obama has ushered in a paralyzing climate of fear for both reporters and their sources. Among the cases it details, 6 government employees plus 2 contractors have faced felony criminal prosecution since 2009 under the 1917 Espionage Act, compared with just 3 prosecutions in all previous U.S. administrations. The Department of Justice has also secretly subpoenaed and seized Associated Press reporters' phone logs and emails, and New York Times reporter James Risen was ordered to testify against a former CIA officer who provided leaked information to him, or Risen would go to jail. The new report is written by Leonard Downey, former executive editor of The Washington Post. He spoke with dozens of journalists who told him officials are, quote, reluctant to discuss even unclassified information because they fear that leak investigations restrictions and government surveillance make it more difficult for reporters to protect them as sources. It comes as Glenn Greenwald, columnist for Britain's Guardian newspaper, who's based in Brazil, testified before a Brazilian Senate committee this week about his work with NSA whistleblower Edward Snowden.
In reality, there is a war against journalism and the process of transparency, and this war is with the government of the United States and its closest allies, mostly the British government. They're doing a lot of things against the freedom of press to hide this whole report, which generally the United States or English government say these things only happen in China or Iran or Russia, but now we can see that the United States government is doing these exact same things.
Politics is fiction. It is an extreme negative polarization of inner decrepitude. It is what happens when human beings don't take command of themselves. When we are dealing in fiction, we can afford great feats of intellect and creativity and possibility. We can suspend for a moment old mechanical routines of politics being somehow central to modern democratic freedom. Democracy, with all its secrecy, administrative density, populism, entitlement and corruption, does not work. Democracy is a fiction. And that's part of the problem for the true-hearted human being. Because if it's not democracy, or capitalism, or socialism, or communism, or anarchy, then what is it? What do we do? Some sort of conscious tribalism? That could be good. Peaceful anarchy with personal responsibility? It is wise to examine matters of great weight and solemnity from a variety of different and even unfamiliar angles. To be hard, to embody aggression, to allow its flow around our self, part of the animal, perfectly natural. Also to be fluid and tender, quietly introspective and supremely sensitive in our being. Tranquil and loving, broad and passionate, spontaneous, fierce, graceful, unknowable. All of these things move us around our subject and tell us something valuable. We circle what we're examining. Today, it is free will that is under scrutiny. We cannot evolve something until we understand it. We cannot truly leave something behind until we have sufficiently comprehended its nature. The last 250 years of US history can be regarded as a reaction against European monarchical repression. In its infancy, and yet free. Imperfect, and yet independent, resilient. To move away from the stupidity of hierarchy and have a shot at equanimity. It is therefore of particular consequence when a government is attempting to return the Republic to European socialism, which this government is currently attempting to do. Many profound and significant events are happening in the United States right now, most of which are sliding beneath the gaze of most Americans and Britons and Europeans. And that is precisely what the media sphere is wanting. To have the hurly-burly of Capitol Hill be just the usual political intrigues and posturing, but that is not the case. I would say the that one of the boldest and most nefarious political tactics in modern history is currently being executed upon the American people. They are being forced to purchase approved medical insurance or face being fined. The fine, by the way, is also referred to by the government as a fee or an individual responsibility payment. And again, more honestly, as a penalty. So unless you do this thing, buy this thing that the government says you need, they're going to penalise you. And in the government's own words, the penalty in 2014 is calculated one of two ways. You'll pay whichever of these amounts is higher, either 1% of your yearly household income or $95 per person for the year. The fee increases every year. In 2015 it is 2% of income, or $325 per person. In 2016 and later years it's 2.5% of income, or $695 per person. After that it's adjusted for inflation. So that's the government's own words. Think about this for a moment. The government is telling free human beings, you have to buy something or we will punish you. This is wrong. And it is wrong by design. They know it's wrong. They know it sounds wrong. But the purpose of Obamacare is to harvest consent. It is a harvesting of consent to subservience. And many Europeans have no clue as to what is going on with this healthcare thing in America, these changes. It is often portrayed in the general media as healthcare reforms to bring affordable medicine to more people. Deeply uninteresting news, isn't it, for the average European mainstream viewer? But as I said in my recent essay, Cult of the Godmen, Obamacare is a very unique thing that is actually 100% about control, as another commentator just said in the previous introduction. And I cannot stress that point enough. The Affordable Healthcare Act is completely about acclimatizing a new generation of Americans to conformity, to relinquishing their own free will and handing it over to the authorities. So I remind myself of this. And it's a unique moment, this, hence the slightly longer than normal introduction. I also remind myself of the lies and dishonour regarding the mass surveillance of human beings. There is a small organisation that is dedicated to monitoring the movement of all human beings on the planet, but it is not American or British or Israeli or Italian. It is not defined by nationality at all. This is really important. It is the empire, monitoring the private thoughts and deeds of its property, us. And so we have to remind ourselves of this ridiculous conceit from time to time. And now is one of those times. We are reaching the point where the people know they are being screwed, and they're on the brink of doing something about it, ready to think and act differently. But make no mistake, this is a path of real independence and fire. It's not about oneness or due process or compassion and love and bliss. It's not about any of that. Independence and fire. It is elemental. Does truth need defending? The answer to that depends upon what you think truth is. What I think truth is means that it requires no defence or safeguarding. Do we need to defend the Constitution? If it is part of a fiction, why protect it? If truth is inviolate and imperishable, why ever bother to scamper around like precocious chimpanzees and believe we are in any way influencing things? What is truth? For me, truth is light. It does not, therefore, require defending. It will be what it is, and then it will cease when it is good and ready. As has been observed in times gone by, it is not just the flowers that wither and die, but the very stars in the sky too. They will blink out into nothingness. What is the empty black space around us? It is everything, and it is mind. When a thing illuminates within it, we call that truth. No fortification necessary. It radiates for a time and then ceases. This is the pulse of the universe, the ebb and flow, receding inwards into stillness, and then poof, the outward flood of motion. The nothing and the something, the pulse of life, the heartbeat of existence, off and on, yielding and forthright, silence, and then sound. All the other truths of men are not really truths at all. They are ideas that have greater or lesser degrees of harmony. The lack of a written people's constitution in Britain means less administrative and mental freedom. People become accustomed to being told what to do, as they do across Europe. Not conscious people. No one tells them what to do. I mean sleepers. Those who have chosen unconsciousness as a way of life, who go with the program. They are comfortable in their obedience. In America, a written constitution and Bill of Rights helps the population have more administrative and mental freedom. To speak openly, freely, the First Amendment is a good thing. To bear arms as a symbol of independence is a good thing right now. We are wise to preserve these as we transition from empire to real human culture. In the end, guns will be obsolete because they will be unnecessary. They will be preserved in the same way that we preserve steam locomotives. But in this transition from empire to real human culture, there are questions, because we don't know what real human culture is yet. We cannot organise ourselves properly. And there's one very simple reason for that. To organise ourselves collectively, we have to organise ourselves personally. I don't mean the paperwork and the sock drawer. I mean the mind and the heart and the will. The life, the fulfilment, the expression. How good is it? Or are they so disorganised that those things are all over the place and there's endless problems and drama? So it requires the inner work to take place first. You can't just get together, because what we're going to do? You have to get it right yourself first. It's half a lifetime, that. And it should be fun. It should be good. It should be an adventure. And then there's an amount of wisdom and a movement with the pulse that affords better judgment, better discernment, more openness, a natural transparency. And key, always, a high degree of emotional intelligence. Without that, you can forget everything else. So you may have noticed again the sound of moving water, which indicates that I am not in the city. In fact, since we last spoke, I have left the city of Portland altogether and moved westwards to the coast. Perched now on the edge of the world, where the mighty forests of Oregon meet the vastness of the Pacific Ocean. So to the west of me now lies Hawaii and Japan and Papua New Guinea and Korea and Taiwan and the Philippines and all that, and Mongolia and China and Russia. So I am far now from Cheshire and Manchester and Lancashire, where I grew up, about 6,000 miles away. Some of the images are fading. Something I would never have imagined 5 short years ago. But there we are. Life has many unexpected eventualities up its sleeve. And I sometimes feel like the Bilbo Baggins of the family, you know, called by unknown adventure and subtle forces to make my way to these distant shores. For no reason. No destiny as such, just a choice. To behold new lands, new people, is my joy. To encounter strange beasts, to see completely novel methods of life and sustenance. I lived in Portland for 18 months and it was excellent. I love Portland. Portland is perhaps, I would say, the best city I have ever been to. And I've been to many brilliant cities around the world. But Portland has that very exceptional blend of warmth, open-mindedness, creativity, humour and independence. A delicate and valuable formula that makes it truly great. And I'm back there all the time. But now my home is nestled among the trees and rivers. When I eat my breakfast, I can see a hummingbird at the window, and a bluebird in the garden, and a chickadee. These things are in the city too, here and there if you look, but here, they come very close to me. Actually, when I first came to the US, I stayed in a very rural part of Washington State, just on the edge of the enormous Olympic National Forest in a region called Puget Sound, that is characterised by all these fabulous waterways and inlets that cover hundreds of square miles, thousands. Not far away, really, from where Twin Peaks was filmed, just to give you an idea of the texture of the place. Really wonderful. So the nearest major city then was Seattle, and Vancouver and Victoria, British Columbia, all that in Canada were just an afternoon drive away to the north. And I loved this place, this Pacific Northwest region. I'd never before in my life seen such colossal forests, except on television. So really there is this single giant forest that swirls down from central Canada, down the west coast of the United States, from Washington to Oregon and down into Northern California. It is what many people refer to as Bigfoot territory. You could walk under tree cover for about 2,000 miles uninterrupted. You could spend your whole life wandering through the forests and never meet a single other human being. Great fondness for this part of the world. For the last few years I've known it. Things I've never seen before. Bears, salmon jumping out of the river, snow over the top of your head, meadows with wildflowers for 100 miles. And one minute you have these extraordinary blue skies, and the next the sky is granite coloured and heavy with endless rain. So people from perpetually sunny places like California or Texas or Florida are not accustomed to the grey and the precipitation. And it can be a challenge for them, apparently. But once you've adapted to it, it is the best weather system on Earth. Proper, full, perfect. seasons. So I have returned to this landscape here, just south of that in Oregon now, this time over to the coast. And there are dozens of these fascinating little towns nestled in the bays and cliffs and shorelines of this coast, running right down from the very top of Oregon down to Northern California. I mean, you could drive away from my house all the way down to San Diego, about 1,000 miles away, and over the border into Mexico if you wanted. But the flavour and tone of the coastal towns that I'm talking about is typified probably by towns that run from the tip of northwest Oregon, like Astoria and Cannon Beach and Nehalem and Rockaway and Tillamook, and then right down to Drake's Bay, just north of San Francisco. Speaking of which, if you've ever seen the brilliant 1980 film The Fog by John Carpenter, that little coastal town depicted in the film is from there. Rays Point, Drake's Bay, Bodega Bay and Inverness. Lovely little places, great little communities, and there are dozens of them. And so I now live in one of those places in Oregon. Good for the soul. Good for my family and friends. Good for well-being and recharging and creativity and insight, and more than anything, I don't really need to tell you this, but connection. Connection to the world, connection to what is around me, more truthfully. To organise yourself properly, to calibrate your consciousness for real interaction with the world, you have to understand will. And will, like mind and heart, is a multidimensional thing. It works in both the visible and the invisible worlds. It is both third and fourth and fifth dimensional. One important physical aspect of will is what we call choice. What we choose to do and not do. Who we choose to be with and not be with. How we choose to treat ourselves. Consider ourselves, heal ourselves, value ourselves. All free will choices. My sister-in-law often says to her daughters, who are like 7 and 9, "Make good choices, girls." And she asks them to consider this with regard to everything, really. Education, friends, food, morality, television, clothes, religion, Nintendo, everything. Make good choices. And in a way, life is like that. It is profoundly shaped by an ongoing sequence of choices that we make. And encouraging young people to consider the nature and ramifications of their choices is an excellent thing to do. As we grow older and more mature and wiser, we see that ultimately everything we do in life is a choice. We choose to breathe. We don't have to. You could stop. We choose to eat and drink. It's not required. And we choose to educate ourselves, to have a good level of friendship and love and togetherness in life, to have some adventure and laughter and artistry and contemplation. Everything is free will. Do or do not. Go this way or go that way. Live or die. Speak or be silent. Be conscious or be unconscious in your life. And we could say that there are a basic set of choices, not essential, but just good. So what might they be? Well, they're kind of common sense, really. This is what I would say they are. Don't injure anyone or pinch their stuff. Be civil and courteous in your behaviour. In fact, the old 1828 Webster's definition of courteous is being of elegant manners, which is no bad thing in this world. Have a good level of hygiene about yourself and your abode. Very important to the samurai, this. Part of being a warrior is to have a clean presentment and habitation. And there's a psychic dimension to that. It's not just about sanitation. The way energy moves is affected by our environment. Educate yourself. Keep educating yourself. Learn things you know nothing about. Don't assume that anyone else's apparent authority makes that an avenue not worthy of your exploration. You go and look at it. You could find something that no one else has ever seen. And just for your own edification and growth, the beauty of learning is endless. Support each other. Support your fellow brothers and sisters, men and women. Give as much, if not more, than you receive. Be conscious of your community. Lastly, make honour, gratitude, love, authenticity, and excellence a big part of your life. So these are choices. You don't have to. You don't have to do any of them. But they're good things, good ways of being. And every human being understands these things, the goodness of them. So long as a person hasn't been indoctrinated and distorted by some dogmatic government or school or religion. As long as they are thinking freely for themselves, then every single human soul inherently knows there is a good and noble way to go about things. To embody a natural righteousness. Don't let the religious people quarantine that word. Righteousness is a fine word. One of its original meanings was acting in accordance with divine ordinance. And from a mystical angle, that is precisely what we're talking about here. It's precisely what we're trying to do. To move in alignment with the higher order of unfolding divinity in creation. As the universe fosters increasing levels of elegance and completeness and discovery and grace, so do we. We help it by lending our witnessing, our consciousness to these proceedings. Our observations and feelings and thoughts and experiences, they all contribute directly to the ongoing refinement of the universe. We're part of it. Creation is a work in progress. It's not finished. Creation is a process, not a thing. It is a process that was initiated, set free to develop, a divine fractal pattern capable of infinite creativity and knowingness and beauty. We might consider it as a method of articulation. God cannot see what is not made by him. Other entities take that pattern and do their own things with it. So agents of consciousness do this seeing for him. Sentient beings, animal, mineral, vegetable, physical, ethereal, light, 3D, 4D, 5D, and onwards, in ever more precise and refined gradients of purity. A musical progression. This is a process of complete and utter independence. Righteousness, or, if you like, true-heartedness, is simply aligning with that original divine pattern. Living in accordance with the unfolding refinement, allowing it into your heart, letting it flow through will, and knowing it with mind. If we lose that supreme independence, if we forfeit that free will journey alongside the universe, then we become little robots, little turnip heads of artificial intelligence and second-hand life. So we ought to be wary when we are mandated to do things against our will. That is, against the natural unfoldment of the universe. So if a merchant comes over to me and says, "You must buy this thing, Neil Kramer, you have to," even without knowing what that thing is, I can tell you that it's wrong already and I won't be doing it. There is nothing that anyone has that I need. Nothing. And I would propose it's the same for all of us. So I'll most likely say to that merchant, "No, I don't want to buy this thing you are putting forward. Not today, not ever." You see, my will is final. No one can contravene that will unless I let them. So if that merchant then fines me, punishes me, then I have to make the decision to either concede or stick to my guns. And that is what we have with Obamacare. It is a test of will for the proletariat. The empire, the contemporary expression of empire in modern government, is desiring to shift thinking away from personal choice and move it towards group directives, commandments from the collective. Let me tell you a parallel story about something that happened in Britain 24 years ago. There was this system of property taxation that existed for ages, which was commonly referred to as the rates. And the rates were calculated by assessing the value of a property and its average rental or mortgage value, etc. And this formula and appraisal was meant to be reassessed every 5 years, but that rarely happened. So it was an imperfect system, but it was okay. It was adequate. And then in 1990, a new system was implemented called the community charge. It sounds quite innocuous, that, doesn't it? But any British listeners will be smiling now because it was more commonly known at the time as the poll tax. And the poll tax was a disastrous system introduced by the late Margaret Thatcher. This tax, this poll, was the most imbalanced, inequitable and purposefully provocative piece of taxation ever put upon the British public. A disgrace it was to modern society and an insult to good people. And the tax was calculated in this really stupid way by counting the number of people living in a house and applying another flat tax on top of that. And it was just plain unfair. You had these vast disparities where poor people were paying more than rich people and average families were just paying a lot more than they should have been doing. And even the rich people were confused too. It was just wrong. Wrong from top to bottom. And everyone knew it. Although the obsequious bastards who worked in Thatcher's administration or cabinet went along with the party line, of course, that though there were a few things to smooth out, it would be okay in the end and was a very important piece of legislation. And some of those cabinet ministers have since been shown to have been embroiled in some of the worst and sickest depravities and abuses of human beings and minors that I have ever heard of. Unproven, but well known to insiders and just beginning to leak into the media sphere now. But this poll tax, though it was heavily marketed as a better way of providing taxation across the nation to people of all backgrounds and means, it did in fact heavily punish those of more modest means. It was the most unjust thing I'd ever seen in my life. Couldn't quite believe it. It was one of those first warning shots when I felt in my bones that something was very wrong with the world, with those people who were supposed to be helping to run our country for us in a fair way. So to cut a long story short, major protests and riots ensued across Britain, particularly in London, massively underreported and whitewashed by the pathetic BBC and others. The reaction by the public was all the more notable because the powerful dissent was being driven and expressed by people from all backgrounds, all demographics, like little old ladies, businessmen, housewives, plumbers, fishermen, students, postmen, factory workers, teachers, everyone, all of society. So following this, millions of people refused to pay the tax. Millions. Some estimates now suggest it might have been 15 million or so, from a population at the time of about 56 million. So the next government scrapped it altogether a couple of years later. Why? Because they had to. It was failing because people were refusing to take part in it. The system buckled under mass non-participation. So I ask you to consider that in light of the Affordable Health Care Act, Obamacare. Is Obamacare a bit like the community charge? I think it is. And I think Americans should carefully consider how they are going to respond if they find themselves of their own choice being necessitated to do so. It is obviously imbalanced. It is against the natural free will of many men and women. And ironically, I have come to understand that the Affordable Health Care Act is not very affordable at all. I could drive you around north, south, west and east Portland and indicate huge areas and communities who won't be able to afford it. Not in a million years. They haven't got the money, so they'll end up being fined. They will be penalised through a backdoor taxation on poor people who can't afford health insurance. You know, there are tens of millions of families where an extra $100 a month, up or down, has an enormous impact. That's about 60 quid. Expecting millions of people in rural Mississippi or Wyoming to pay $400 a month each is ridiculous. It's bullshit, and they know it. I travelled to Sedona recently, a beautiful area in the northern Verde Valley region of Arizona, which is characterized by these striking red sandstone formations all over the landscape. And I was working there with a client. It was an excellent visit. And during our discourse, we wandered across this gorgeous land and visited some of its many sacred places. And we allowed the land to guide us in certain ways of thinking and being, sometimes to amplify things and sometimes to soothe. And this is a big part of my life and work, working with people one-to-one. And what is it I'm doing exactly, some people might wonder. Well, I help people in their conscious development, in attaining a contemporary, mystical outlook, in managing constructive change in life. People usually come to me when they are already at a crossroads and want some guidance, and there are many, many crossroads in life for all of us. They are people who have reached a certain level of self-awareness and clearly done a degree of house cleaning in themselves. And frankly, they're seeking answers. Answers about real fulfillment, well-being, connection, aliveness, magic, real metaphysical secrets about life. And those things are intimately related to each other, all of them. It is a deep work. You can read about it on the website, neilkramer.com. And when we are physically together, we walk through the natural landscape or the town, and we sit in cafes and atriums and lounges, or we stroll through the park or the coastline, and we talk. We create a space for a very high quality of dialogue. And this allows a flow of wisdom and insight and an examination of and a clarity in new ways of being. So this is my work. And this is what led me to Arizona recently on one journey. So I spent some wonderful time there. And then it was time to leave, of course, and return home. And that involved getting a shuttle bus, PHX, Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport in Arizona, because on this occasion I hadn't needed a rental car. And then, of course, to catch a plane back to Portland International. On both of these vehicles, I met a remarkable person. This doesn't always happen, but it did this time. The first encounter was with a lady I met on the shuttle bus back to Phoenix. Her name was Cindy. And I won't go into tremendous detail, but let me tell you, that woman in her 70s had made and was making enormous changes in her life and consciousness. Brave, true things. She was doing the inner work. This was the real thing. I mean, granted, her age and her sense of mortality had lent a sense of urgency to matters a little, for sure. But nevertheless, there she was, being awesome in her growth. I would say that most 75-year-olds gave up on life 50 years ago. Not so for Cindy. She completely changed her life. Left her husband of 40 years, travelled around the world on a modest budget, very cleverly managed, lived with her female friend, as friends and colleagues and comrades, supporting each other. She'd processed old memories of trauma, which is rare to do at that age. And she'd faced her demons and said no to the routines of those family and friends and church people around her who knew nothing about life. And she'd come to understand this. And there she was, this old lady, tottering about on her hip replacement, on another adventure on her own, thundering through the desert with me in a small bus that was being driven by the ghost of Steve McQueen. Going a little too fast, really, but we didn't mind, because our consciousness was keeping us all safe. Me, Cindy, the driver, and these two other ladies. They didn't know that, but Cindy did, and I did. And Cindy was using these particular words too, words that you and I might take for granted now, but you don't often hear in mainstream reality tunnel conversation. Words like conscious, manifest, emotional intelligence, forgiveness, truth, fulfillment, destiny. These were the words coming out of her mouth, and I was like, this old lady has been doing some work. So she told me this story, and a couple of other people were listening too, and it was full of change and bravery and crisis and transformation. It was amazing, truly, truly amazing. And at the end of it, I put my hand on her shoulder. She was sat next to me, and I simply said, that is a journey of inner growth and great truth. And tears came to her eyes, streamed down her cheeks, and she nearly lost it totally. But they were tears of happiness, because she knew that I understood exactly what she was talking about, exactly what she'd been through. She felt known and seen in that moment, and it was a privilege to know her and see her. And that was it. We talked and talked. And I never tell people what I do or anything usually, but I did her, and she wrote down the web address and so on, and we gave a sort of perfunctory, polite opportunity for inclusion to the other two people on the shuttle bus who occasionally joined in, but they weren't really properly tuned in. They didn't really get it, not what we were talking about. They didn't appreciate the depth of this woman's journey, and then we sort of lost them all together when Cindy started talking about mediumship and extra-dimensional communication. That was it then. Finished. And it was all just awesome. It was just brilliant. What a brilliant woman. And we were all going to Phoenix Airport, and it was me who was dropped off first at Terminal 2, getting onto Alaska Airlines flight. And we got out, and I bid goodbye to everyone, and then gave Cindy a massive hug and said in her ear, "You are a very special lady." And I meant it, really meant it. So, as well as seeing my wonderful client in Sedona, who was very hospitable and excellent and truthful, I also connected with this other special person, and we made a difference. We changed something. Another little gear lever clicked around, and we refined ourselves. So, I get inside the airport, get my boarding pass from a nice lady at the counter, go through security, get a bottle of water, and sit down and wait. Wait for the plane. On time, thankfully, and only an hour for me to wait, no problem. So I get on the plane, middle seat, not ideal. I had a lovely window seat going out, but no worries, doesn't matter. And the seats were large enough, and I was sat just behind the first class section, so I had all this extra leg room, it was cool. To my left sat this sullen 40-year-old businessman who just read his tablet device thing, And when he did sit back to look into space and drink a Coca-Cola, he just looked worried. Not worried about the flight, but worried about his life. And in that moment, I saw myself in him, in an alternative timeline. It could have been me very easily, same age, same stocky build, same furrowed brow, but he was doing things he didn't want to do. He was in a place he didn't want to be in. He was wearing clothes he didn't like. He was building for a future that he didn't believe in. I could feel it oozing out of his pores. And I empathised with him. Clearly, he didn't want to exchange or talk or whatever, so even my little pleasantries for 20 seconds. Hello, how are you? Have you had a good trip? And all that. He didn't really want to talk. So I left him to his own devices, if you pardon the pun. And he didn't say another word. On my right was an old man, probably 80, and he had a little twinkle in his eye. And his name, as he later told me, was Jack. Jack's wife had died recently, and I could tell that he was feeling it. But he was okay. He was strong. And he'd been in the military much of his younger and middle age. Then later he worked in business, but in quite a maverick and bold way, according to him. Joined various organisations in management positions before sort of taking over. Get in and take over, he said to me. Work for yourself as soon as possible. And Jack spent some of the year in Arizona, near Prescott, or Camp Verde, I think he said, somewhere around there. And now he was flying home to Alaska in December to stay with family for Christmas. And he had 3 lovely daughters who looked after him really well. And I could feel the pride and gratefulness in him. And he talked me through their achievements in education and work and life and motherhood and so on. And he was clearly very proud of them, and he wanted me to know it. And I'll be honest, he did talk about himself a lot, and he never really asked me anything, as far as I can recall. And that reflected a certain insecurity in the man, for sure. A quiet but old doubt about his own worth. Very common, that. So he had to talk things up and amplify things. That's what he did. But the root of it was real, and he was a good man. And I wasn't so conceited in myself that I couldn't see past this subconscious behaviour of his. It doesn't matter. I could enjoy his stories and his way of speaking and just listen. Just listen for a change. And probably learn a few things. So he talked constantly for 30 minutes, in this slow but deliberate, clear voice. And then he fell asleep, and he gently snored on and off for about 2 hours. But it was a nice snore. You know, some people snore, it's like a sort of dying elk in it. His was like a gentle murmur, it was nice. And we occasionally looked out of the window together when he, woke up, and we marvelled at the massive snow-covered mountains of western Arizona and Nevada, California. But mostly he was snoozing. And then in the last 30 minutes of the flight, he woke up and became animated again. And he talked about his life in Alaska and further near the pole, where the sun just went round and round in little circles over your head, and it never went dark. And he talked about fishing through holes in the ice and the things he'd learned from the native Inuit people, how to stay warm, how to hunt, to cook, preserve food, get water, and all kinds of things. It was fascinating. And toward the end, he started talking politically and nailed his colours to the mast pretty clearly. Self-reliance, enterprise and opportunity, small government, the preservation of the republic. So he was a pretty typical conservative, really. And then, before long, he risked a very scathing comment about Obama. And he looked at me once he'd said it, and he waited for a second. And I think in the back of his mind, he might have been wondering whether I was one of those, emblematic lefty Portland progressive liberal hippies. And he quickly realised that I most certainly was not, when I said, well, as an outsider, Obama is attempting to convert this country into a sort of Euro-style globalist state. And I told him all the things that I considered made America special. Its spirit of a republic, its resilience, its independence, its written constitution and Bill of Rights, its affirmative general attitude in life. All that was being dismantled as quickly as possible. And I told him that I wasn't a Democrat or a Republican, don't really identify with any of that at all. But I did care about freedom, and despite lots of weirdness and prevarication, I felt that the United States was the freest inhabited modern civilization that I had ever experienced. And he looked at me for a second and said, "Damn right it is." And then he offered his hand and said, "My name's Jack." And that was it. The plane landed, we taxied to the gate, got out, shook hands, and parted ways. Many of you have written to tell me how much you enjoy these recordings. I appreciate it. I'm glad you like them. And you've remarked, many of you, that you feel a special connection with them. They are somehow more personal and reflective than other forms of audio recordings out there. And because of that, a different level of communication is feasible. Well, that delights me, I have to say. It really does, because that is exactly what I'm trying to achieve. The design of these recordings is meant to bring the listener in, and it's meant to bring a more personal thing out of me and to share that. And by positioning the recordings in more lifelike circumstances, the sort of temperament and disposition of the dialogue, I think, is improved. They're more authentic, not mere transmissions of data and information, but really rather personal observations. And that is all. And if people enjoy sharing in these observations and ideas, then great, you may find them useful, and if not, that's fine. I tended to think that they might appeal largely to the more mature audience, given their very contemplative nature. But many young people in their 20s and even in the teens have also written to me and said they love them. And really part of it is to create a serious but enjoyable space where we can think. Because obviously you listen to me and think about what I'm saying, but then off we go and we change it and make modifications, we adapt stuff. But in this space we can think and reflect and listen together. Give ourselves moments of stillness, sometimes in motion, that stillness, sometimes absolutely unmoving, where we can look into the mystery of life with truth and optimism and pleasure. In natural ways, to question, to speak, to pause for breath, to listen, to have moments of nothing. As it is in life, to hear the birds, the ocean, the wind, to hear cars pass by, to laugh and sigh and shout and whisper. There are things possible in these recordings that are not possible to achieve in other formats. I do want to take the listener on a journey, for you to sit with me and walk with me, to be here and think about our lives and our world, to discuss problems, visions, magic, and the strange business of living, to feel, perhaps, that we're in this together. We need not always be alone in our intimate ruminations. Some of us can be with people all the time, some of us not. However, we can share them anyway, because we often have the same thoughts, so it's good to give words to each other's reflections. I first heard the word Roamcast from a guy in England called Niall Murphy, aka Opaque Lens. Hello, Niall. Like me, he is very fond of using words in inventive ways. So thank you to Niall for this word, and do check out his excellent show, Shamanic Freedom Radio. I've met Niall and he's a good man, intelligent, sensitive, funny, real, and I hope to be talking to him again soon and we'll be making a recording. The Roamcast gives an impression of moving contemplation. A window into someone else's thoughts and movements in life. A reflection that is happening in real time here, in the same world as everyone else. Away from schedules and structures and routines, a little freer. On earth, on the soil, on the sand, on the highway, on the country roads, in the living rooms, in the kitchen, everywhere. To go out with no plan and just be. Improvise. See what comes. See what transpires in this exquisitely incongruous physical hologram that we are so hopelessly immersed in. Many people are telling me that they are fed up with reading. They have grown tired of it. They are doing less of it. And it may interest you to know that it is the same for me too. I rarely read. I read to study when I am compelled to, but I am rarely buying books or electronic texts or newspapers or anything, magazines, and reading it. Instead, I've increasingly turned to the spoken word. The audiobook, the auditory exchange. I am embracing sound more than print, the waveform rather than the page. So as I've come to appreciate the spoken word more, producing these Roamcasts is my way of giving back, being creative, sharing reflections, new and old, novel perspectives. And it is good to hear the human voice in our observations, be they subtle or penetrating. The voice adds something. It helps us to hear how instead of just what. The voice helps us get a sense of a way of being. I just listened to The Mysterious Stranger by Mark Twain, and the skillful narrator and the words combined to forge something truly extraordinary. The landscapes I saw, the situations I felt, the experiences I had in the inner world, crafted by Twain and the narrator and my imagination. So precious. This would have been impossible as a movie, but as voice, It was a very sweet thing. There are many special places along the Washington and Oregon coastline. You could spend months just touring around and exploring them, maybe years. And I have found one new place just a few weeks ago, somewhat synchronistically, because it wasn't altogether a conscious decision to go there, it just sort of happened, and yet it was exactly right. You get off the main road, off the highway, onto this smaller country road, and a mile in, you start to feel like you're suddenly starting to leave human civilization behind. And on your left is the Pacific Ocean, the largest ocean on the planet, and the cliffs and rocks and trees go right up to the edge of it. And on your right, hundreds of square miles of forest, raw, innocent, merciless, primeval forest. And the further you go along this road, the more you can feel the wilderness around you, surrounding you. Quiet but powerful. A wild place where you feel somehow like a ghostly visitor. And there is a total absence of human infrastructure, of course, but also of human consciousness. Detached, separate. The values, the morality, the industry, and the facilities of modern civilization are gone, offline. There is only the immaculate physical immediacy of nature, primitive, connected. And unlike hiking on foot or flying over in a plane, when you're driving in the car you can feel the sudden crossing of a threshold. There is a definite point where you can physically feel the shift. The unreality signal is gone. And you can detect this abrupt atmospheric divergence. It's like a vacuum, kind of disquieting for a moment. Even for a seasoned unreality voyager like me, it's an eerie thing. It's a bit like those times when you're on your own in the house, and it's the middle of the day, and everyone else is gone. The whole world is out working or doing something else somewhere, and the house is quiet, static. And sometimes that can be very peaceful and lovely, and at other times it can feel a little odd to some people, and so they turn the radio on. They listen to other human voices on NPR or Radio 4 or some music, or have the television on in the background, or they make a phone call, something to break that subtle but repressive hush. And that's what it's like moving along this coastal promontory that I have found. If you know a place, anything like this, go to it soon. Be there away from the unreality signal of men and machines. Be there alone, or with a special person who understands these things. Don't go with a normal person. They'll interrupt the magic. Their mental noise will spoil it. When you're in one of these magical locations, you are close to divinity. And so you can look into yourself more truthfully. It is often a surprise to see how empty we are, how innocent and how like children we are. Even in our 40s and 60s and 80s, nothing has changed. We are little beings going about in an extraordinary universe. The source of the universe flows into these places every day, every moment. These places speak to it, this source, and it speaks to them. This godly space brings us out of our haze and into something very lucid and unclouded. It is the nature of the untainted consciousness that fills us with life. There is at once a sudden recognition of our own inexorable mortality, but also the endlessness of life, entwined with all life, all unfolding and blossoming here on our earth, and through the stars and all their worlds. It is life, and we are deeply enmeshed in it, and it is joyful.